Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
All right, so this week's parasha is Parashat Yitro. We're going to cover Exodus 18, 1 to 20, 23. Always start with the blessing. Baruch Adonai Borach, Baruch Adonai Borach Leolam Vaed, Baruch Ata Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher בחר בנו מכל העמים ונתן לנו את תורתו, ברוך אתה אדוני נותן התורה. All right, so this Torah portion is going to cover a lot of the spheres, pretty much everything, basically, but mainly it's going to cover righteousness and justice, because it's where we get the Ten Commandments, the basis for the Torah, and the basis for righteousness and justice in the Torah. Covenants, it's pretty self-explanatory, and sacred space. We're not going to cover this, but if you guys remember, the Mount Sinai was divided into like 3 different sections, we could say it, and it's very similar to how the temple was divided into 3 different sections going up in holiness. We're not going to cover that today, but really cool concept to keep in mind. So now we're going to start a summary of the parasha for those who didn't read it. All right. So the parasha starts with Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, visiting Moses in the wilderness, and he brings Moses' wife and children to him. Then Jethro hears about everything that God has done for the Israelites, and he's really happy about it. Then Jethro gives Moses some advice on leadership, and he suggests that Moses delegates authority, and he advises Moses to appoint capable men to act as judges for the people and to handle smaller matters, leaving only the most difficult cases to Moses. And this system of delegation helps Moses avoid burnout and ensure that the Israelites have a more efficient governance structure. Basically, the Sanhedrin. Moses was in charge of everything. He was getting burnt out, too much for one person to handle. So obviously they have the elders and the people that are knowledgeable about the Torah so they can take care of things so that Moses doesn't have to take care of everything. And then we have the preparation for God's covenant. So then the Israelites, they get to Mount Sinai. And then God commands them that if they obey his voice and keep his covenant, then they will be his segula, his treasure possession, a kingdom of priests, and a holy nation. But a priest in the sense of function, but not in office. So it doesn't mean that Aaron and the priesthood is no good. It just means that we have to be as if we were priests to the nation. So we're kind of like the intermediaries between people and God, just like the priests did that in the temple. And the people were consecrated. They had to wash their clothes, refrain from certain activities. And the mountain is surrounded by boundaries to prevent people from approaching it. And then God appears on the 3rd day. Interesting timeline. On the 3rd day he appears and he descends on the mountain in a dramatic display of thunder, lightning, and thick cloud. And the people are terrified, but then Moses reassures them. And then the 10 commandments are given, self-explanatory. And then the people are really afraid, and so they tell Moses to go speak with God on their behalf, as they're terrified by a direct encounter with him. And in the ancient Near East, it was a common thing that if you go into direct contact with a god, it's probably going to make you die. So it was, their fear wasn't like they just became afraid because thunder. It's a real thing in the ancient Near East that if anybody gets too close to a god, they could actually die. And then Moses' role is basically sealed as the mediator between God and the people, and we're going to look at that a little bit later. So basically, we're going to look at what is a theophany. Theophany, we'll explain. Then we're going to see what Moses' first encounter of God meant, among other things, the Sinai theophany, and then finally we'll finish up with the 10 Commandments. So what is a theophany? Fancy word. So a theophany, it refers to a visible or tangible manifestation of God to humans. It's derived from the Greek word theos, God, and phino. I don't speak Greek, so I don't know if I'm butchering that, but you get the idea. God appearance. This doesn't have to be literally God. It can be an angel. It can be in a dream, as we'll see in some examples. So this is a good example of a theophany. Moses encounters God with a burning bush. So obviously it was kind of like intermediated, I guess we could say that. God spoke to Moses. And then we also see a theophany in Ezekiel, bless you. And we also see a theophany in Ezekiel 1-3, and it's really, really interesting. So kind of to get an idea of what theophanies are like, we're going to kind of read some of it. So if somebody would like to start, not everybody all at once.
I'll read it.
Thank you, Jonathan.
I looked and I saw a windstorm coming out of the north, an immense cloud with flashing lightning and surrounded by brilliant light. In the center of the fire looked like glowing metal, and in the fire was what looked like 4 living creatures. In appearance, their form was human, but each of them had 4 faces and 4 wings. Their faces looked like this. Each of the four had the face of a human being, and on the right side of each had the face of a lion, and on the left of the face of an ox. Each also had the face of an eagle. The appearance of the living creatures was like burning coals of fire or like torches. Fire moved back and forth among the creatures. It was bright, and lightning flashed out of it. The creatures sped back and forth like flashes of lightning.
Yeah, so this is not all of it. We're kind of like, I cut off a lot, so you get the gist of it. So if anybody would like to read the next part.
As I looked at the living creatures, I saw a wheel on the ground beside each creature with its four faces. This was the appearance and structure of the wheels. They sparkled like topaz, and all four looked alike. Each appeared to be made like a wheel intersecting a wheel. The rims were high and awesome, and all four rims were full of eyes all around.
Then there came a voice from above the vault over their heads as they stood with lowered wings. Above the vault over their heads was what looked like a throne of lapis lazuli, and high above on the throne was a figure like that of a man. I saw that from what appeared to be his waist up, he looked like glowing metal, as if full of fire, and that from there down he looked like fire, and brilliant light surrounded him, like the appearance of a rainbow in the clouds on a rainy day, so was radiance around him. This was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. When I saw it, I fell face down, and I heard the voice of one speaking.
Anybody else?
Might as well keep reading.
He said to me, Son of man, stand up on your feet, and I will speak to you. As he spoke, the Spirit came into me and raised me to my feet, and I heard him speaking to me. He said, Son of man, I am sending you to the Israelites, to a rebellious nation that has rebelled against me. They and their ancestors have been in revolt against me to this very day.
All right, and then he says, and go, get to the captives, to the children of your people, and speak to them and tell them, thus says the Lord God, whether they hear or whether they refuse. And the Spirit lifted me up, and I heard from behind me a great thunderous voice, blessed is the glory of the Lord from his place. Maybe you guys recognize that.
Yes.
Maybe not. We'll talk about it later. All right, so the theophany, basically that whole thing, that's a very summarized thing. It's from Ezekiel 1-2, a little bit of 3. So if you guys want to read it on your own, really interesting. Very, very interesting. Yeah. So a lot of times, I don't know, I haven't read that much. So like when I was reading the book for this, I was like, oh my gosh, what is this? This is in the Bible. So it's really cool. So the theophany marked the beginning of Ezekiel's prophetic ministry. So basically, that's how the book of Ezekiel starts. That's how he's legit. Basically, he had this vision, and that makes him legit as a prophet. So him having the vision of the theophany of God, it basically sealed the deal that he's now a legit prophet, and God sends him, and he gives him a commission. So what he's gonna do. So the primary function of theophanies, not the, but like a primary function of theophanies is the initiation into a new relationship and or transformation. This is from a book called Encountering the Divine. It's really interesting. It goes into like all the little details of all the theophanies. Other examples are Abraham and the 3 angels. Jacob's dream was also considered a theophany, the burning bush. Jacob's fight with the angel. Bilam also encounters an angel, also a theophany. Joshua encounters an angel, also a theophany. And Samuel hears God while asleep, also a theophany. And there's a bunch of other examples, but these are kind of like the main ones. And this is a fancy chart of basically a lot of things that all the theophanies have in common. So basically, like most of them are going to be alone most of the time. A lot of times the location is specified. Then usually it's visual, so like they actually see something. And then there's a message usually comes after. This is like all the theophanies, most of them in the Bible. And then the person usually responds. Sometimes people die, sometimes they don't. So in the case of Nadab and Abihu, they died, and that was considered a theophany. And then a lot of times, sometimes people are a little bit skeptical. And then after everything happens, the person does something. So usually the theophany happens, they don't just stay with it, they do something about it. So like either, for example, the prophets, they go and they prophesy. Moses, when he's appointed as the mediator of the covenant, or see like these 3 examples, they all become prophets and they do something about it. So it's like very cool how you see like that pattern of all these encounters with God, and they're all very similar. They're like unique in their own way, but they're also similar. And then, so usually, like we mentioned, the people are usually isolated. The person, in most cases, is isolated. In theophany stories, they're usually separated from their family, or others in preparation for what's in most cases a solitary experience. So when you see with Jacob, whenever he has the dream, you see that he was alone. So it was really interesting because he left, or whenever he also fought the angel, he actually, the text specifies that he left and he went to another side. He left his family, everything. He was all alone. Moses with the burning bush was all alone. A lot of times when there's a theophany, usually the person is by themselves. So, and then afterwards, they're usually either fascinated or terrified, after the experience. You see this with the Israelites. They're absolutely terrified after they see what happened on Mount Sinai. So that's a very common theme also that happens. And then this is another theophany, the one in Isaiah 6. I'm going somewhere with this, I promise. So if somebody would like to read this.
In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord high and exalted, seated on a throne. And the train of his robe filled the temple. Above him were seraphim, each with 6 wings. With 2 wings they covered their faces, with 2 they covered their feet, and with 2 they were flying. And they were calling to one another.
Exactly. And then they said, Kadosh, 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 Adonai Tzvaot. So they said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord Almighty. The whole earth is full of his glory, just like we say during service. And the sound of their voices, the doorposts and the threshold shook, and the temple was filled with smoke. Some people say that's the smoke of incense. Interesting. And then incense, it represents people's prayers. So there's like a lot to go into there. And then he says, woe to me, I cried. I am ruined, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips, and my eyes have seen the King, the Lord Almighty. So here we see again the theme of being terrified. He's terrified because, again, in the ancient Near East, when you see or encounter God, you could literally die. And so then one of the seraphim flew to me with a live coal in his hand, which he had taken from the tongs of the altar. With it he touched my mouth and said, see, this has touched your lips. Your guilt is taken away and your sin atoned for. Then I heard the voice of the Lord saying, whom shall I send, and who will go for us? And I said, Hineni, here am I, send me. And that's also a common thing in theophanies. A person is usually like, here I am, like, I'm going to do it. See? So the same thing here as we saw with Ezekiel. He was commissioned to be a prophet. He was legitimized. Yes, thank you. He was legitimized and he was given a commission to be a prophet. So there's like a change in his status, a change in a relationship there after the theophany. Then what do these two passages have in common? Any thoughts? That has to do with today.
Passages you mean are...
These two like sections.
Ezekiel
and Isaiah. So they're both included in the Kedusha prayer. So it's really, really interesting. So that's a little bit, I couldn't find it in English, but yeah. So that's what we say on Shabbat whenever we say yes.
I was going to say, if you could explain it.
Yes, yeah. So that's what we say in Shabbat. So whenever we say, so santificaremos tu nombre en el mundo tal como lo consagraron las alturas. So basically the first section, it talks about Isaiah 6, where it says, holy, holy, holy. And then the second part is Ezekiel, the first one that we saw. And afterwards, it's a psalm. So it's really, really interesting. I don't know. After you read those two sections, it kind of makes you, like, whenever you do this, you're like, oh my gosh. And then you have, like, all that stuff in your brain. You're like, oh, that's really cool. So it's really interesting. It's kind of like people imitating angels when you do that. And that's why it's like a response, like, answer, like, question, answer type of thing. So that's why the person says, and then the people respond. And so it's really interesting. It's a whole rabbit hole. It's very cool. So just keep that in mind whenever we do that prayer. It just gives it a little more perspective, I guess. All right, now we're going to look at Moses' first encounter with God. This was a theophany. So the primary function of theophanies, remember, it's an initiation into a new relationship and or transformation. A primary function, not the primary function. And then usually the person, like we mentioned, the person is isolated and alone. He's usually given a task. So Moses, in this case, he was commissioned to speak to Pharaoh and lead the Israelites out of Egypt. And Moses was very afraid. And then in theophany stories, remember how they're always separated from people to get like prepared for the experience. And then they're given a task. And there's a change in relationship. This is really interesting because what task is Moses given other than go speak to the people and take them out of Egypt? Also, this is from Exodus 3:12. So, and he said, for I will be with you, and this is a sign for you that it was I who sent you. When you take the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain. So what's the point of that part of the point of this theophany is to point us to Sinai. And then so the ultimate goal of Moses' first theophany was to bring the people to Sinai. And he was also commissioned everything just like the prophets. And it's really cool because the Hebrew word for bush in the burning bush, it only appears 2 times in the Bible, and it always refers to God dwelling in the bush. But the word is sne, and it sounds a lot like Sinai, sne. You see the word play. So it's really cool, that little thing, I guess. There could be connection, there could not, but it's pretty convincing. It's pretty interesting. So with that in mind, we move on to the Sinai theophany, the one in this parasha. So remember, usually the person is going to be isolated, going to be given a task and the commission and or a commission. There's a relationship change, and there's usually fear. So isolation. So the Israelites, so in contrast to the Sinai theophany, all other group theophany narrative, they use conventional symbolic representation of the divine. So usually it's like either fire or kavod. Like whenever they dedicated the temple, there was a big fire, or there was the glory of God, and contained no spoken elements addressed directly to the people. So whenever the temple was dedicated, you see the big fire, or you see the glory of God appearing there, but the people aren't addressed directly by God. They're spoken to Moses or somebody else, but God doesn't directly speak to the people in those cases. So the Sinai theophany is very, very unique because God directly speaks to the people. And then the person is usually giving a task, or there's a change of relationship. So this was from Exodus 19:9, and the Lord said to Moses, "Behold, I am coming to you in the thickness of the cloud in order that the people hear when I speak to you, and they will also believe in you forever." And Moses relayed the words of the people to God. So Moses here, he was basically confirmed as a mediator to the covenant. So with the burning bush, Moses was given the commission, and then here it was like he was confirmed, like officially, you're going to be the official mediator of the covenant now. So so that the people, they will also believe in you forever, right? So this is like part of the point of the theophany and part of the change in relationship / initiation from Moses' perspective. But the people also have a change in relationship with God, just like we saw with the prophets, the same thing. So you guys remember what kind of relationship the people are entering into with God at Sinai? Yes, maybe. Yes. Yes. And you guys remember what kind of covenant? Yes. Yes. Yes, yes, yes. All right, so it's a suzerain vassal covenant. So remember how the suzerain is the sovereign or the king, and the vassal are the subjects or the servant. This is a kind of a covenant that existed in the ancient Near East during the time where the Israelites were. It's a type of covenant that was very common between kings and their subjects. So the Torah, specifically Deuteronomy, is modeled after this kind of covenant. It's crazy how it's just identical. It's the same thing, like the structure, not the contents. So it's really cool. And so there's a suzerain. In this case, it will be God. There's a vassal suzerain, which is the mediator. So we have Moses is the mediator, and then we're all the vassals. So we're the ones that are supposed to be loyal to God. And we're probably going to be talking about this more in the future, so we're not going to go into too many details. But one of the things that the ancient Near Eastern suzerain vassal covenants have in common with the Torah one is that there's a provision to put the treaty, so like a copy of the treaty, into the temples of the both kingdoms. So if, for example, we'll put like modern day countries, if Iraq did a suzerain vassal covenant with Egypt, then with their gods, they would put a copy in the like the top god of Iraq, and then a top god temple of Egypt. They will put a copy of the covenant there. But in this case, in the Israelites, we see there's 2 tablets, and then they're both put in God's temple because that was God's temple. But so that's the temple, the main God's temple of the Israelites, and then God is also there. Is this making sense? Yes? Okay. So this is why a lot of people say that the 10 Commandments are actually not written like that. They were actually 2 identical copies. Since the suzerain vassal covenants, they had 2 identical copies, each to each person's temple. So in this case, they were both in the same temple because God was God, and God was also the suzerain. Yes. Sure? Okay. All right. And then he gave to Moses, when he had finished speaking to him on Mount Sinai, the 2 tablets of the testimony written on a stone written by the finger of God. You guys remember where these were put?
Ark.
Yes, exactly. All right. So, and then also another change in relationship between Israel and God is that it was a metaphoric wedding between Israel and God. And this is like very talked about, especially among like rabbinical commentaries and everything. But one like form of evidence that we have that it's that metaphor, first of all, there's a prophets which talk about Israel as the bride and God divorcing Israel whenever they're unfaithful. But also it mentions this verse where it says, "Velakachti etchem elai le'am," so I will take you as my own people and I will be your God. But the word for took in Hebrew is usually used in the Bible to mean taking a wife. So you guys probably remember some verses where it says, and Esau went here and he took himself a wife from there and he took a wife. So the word to take in Hebrew, in biblical Hebrew, it's used a lot to mean to take a wife. So in this case, God takes Israel as to be his wife, metaphorically, obviously. So as we saw, there's isolation. So the Israelites are isolated. Not only are the people isolated, but they're isolated out of Egypt. So as they're taken out of Egypt, it's actually preparing them for the theophany, right? So first there was Egypt. They're all mixed up with all those people. And they're taken out of Egypt, and slowly, little by little, they're taken into isolation, into the desert to prepare them for this moment. And then there's a change in relationship. So they enter a suzerain vassal relationship with God. And it's also like a metaphorical wedding. And also Moses is given his task and commission. He's officially now the mediator of the covenant. Is this making sense so far? Okay. And then there's the fear portion. So the protagonist, whenever there's theophanies, is usually fascinated and or terrified after the theophany. What was the point of the people being afraid? So Exodus 19:18 says, when all the people saw the thunder and the flashes of lightning and the sound of the trumpet and the mountain smoking, the people were afraid and trembled, and they stood far off. So this is a quote from the book. It says that Israel undergoes this experience at Sinai, not just to understand the requirements, so like the commandments, but to gain experience. Because there's this phrase where it says, leman nasot etchem, so it's in order to test you. But that word can also be translated as to gain experience. Meaning like the Israelites, they gain experience from God. So they acquire a sense of God. So how it is he is to be perceived, and mostly how he's to be feared. So basically what Mount Sinai, I think, was also kind of to scare people. Like, this is serious. This is not an imaginary little thing. Like, this is a serious thing. And they were terrified in a good way. It's not a bad way. So with all of that in mind, does anybody have any questions so far of that? Make all sense? Everything makes sense? Yes.
So you're saying that a theophany, to summarize, can you summarize once again what's a theophany?
Yes. So a theophany is the encounter with God.
An encounter with God. Okay,
different
so
ways.
you're saying that this experience that Israel had, with that whenever the Ten Commandments was given, was a theophany.
Yes.
And it was a theophany because of what 4 points again? Not
What?
because of what 4 points, but like
Main points.
yeah.
Well, the way we know it's a theophany is because God appeared and they saw God, they heard God, they experienced God in a way. And then there's a lot of commonalities between the other theophanies. So there's the isolation point, there's a change in relationship, and there's fear. There's a lot of things in common. It's probably like the top coolest theophany in the Bible also, I would say.
But you said it was isolation for one person, right?
Yes, and then in
all
this,
of Israel's home.
yes.
So it makes it special.
Exactly. There's like a couple other group theophanies, so like when the temple is dedicated, but the unique thing about Sinai is that God speaks to the people directly. It's not just to like legitimize the temple, so that's very few group theophanies, and it's very cool.
Yeah, also, I was studying this week, in the ancient Near East, it was always a theophany of sorts in the ancient Near East and other places, usually was only in a private place, and only one person was allowed to have that moment. Versus, like Johnny was saying, here everyone could see the moment.
Yeah, and then most of the times in the Bible, it's also individual, so it's really cool how it's very, very unique. It's not just something that happened. It's very unique and very special. And also that also explains why the Israelites had to separate themselves and had to cleanse themselves, because they were going to hear from God directly. So that's pretty crazy. That doesn't happen to a group ever again in the Bible. So that's really cool also. All right, so now we're going to look at the 10 Commandments. So there's this famous verse, and a lot of people quote it. It's Mark 12:28-31. So I don't know if anybody wants to read it for me. Not everybody at once.
I'll read it.
Okay.
One of the teachers of the law came and heard them debating. Noticing that Yeshua had given them a good answer, he asked him, of all the commandments, which is the most important? The most important one, answered Yeshua, is this. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength. The second is this. Love your neighbor as yourself. There is no commandment greater than these.
Exactly. So a lot of people take that to see, yay, that means all I have to do is be nice to people and love God, and that's it, and we're done. That's all I have to do. The Torah's done away with. That's exciting. Not. So that's not what that means. In other words, Yeshua is basically saying all of them, because he said the most important one is, hear our God, the Lord, hear Israel, the Lord our God is one. So the Shema, the confession of faith, where you swear your allegiance to God, and then he says to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your strength, and with all of your soul, and with all of your mind. So what does that mean? How do you love God? By doing keeping his commandments, by being loyal to God. And the second one is love your neighbor as yourself. So he says there's no commandment greater than these, because these basically summarize the entire Torah. He's not saying that the other ones don't matter. He's just saying these are the ones that encompass everything, right? Because if you love God, you're going to keep Shabbat. If you love God, you're going to do Yom Kippur. If you love God, you're going to keep kosher. If you love your neighbor, you're not going to steal. You're not going to lie. You're not going to bear false witness. So basically it encompasses all the commandments. It's not saying that like now we can do whatever we want and these are the only, love is the most important thing, love. It basically saying that all the commandments are important. And then there's two kinds of commandments that people like to divide the commandments into kind of two big categories like these. There's the commandments are ben adam lamakom, so between man and God. And there's the other ones where it's ben adam lechavero, so it's between man and his fellow. So there's commandments like, for example, Shabbat. It's between you and God. Like, it doesn't really matter what people do. Like, it's just you and God. So you keep Shabbat. Doesn't really matter what everybody else does. But then there's the ben adam lechavero, so there's between man and his fellow. So, for example, stealing, that's between you and God, obviously, because God says not to steal. But mostly it's between you and another person. So you can't do that to another person. So there's kind of like two ways of dividing the commandments, between you and God and between you and your friends. And so then when we look at this, he's basically saying both kinds of commandments. Love God and love your neighbor, meaning be loyal to God and be loyal to your neighbor. So both kinds of commandments, the one between you and God and the one between man and his fellow. And if we look at the 10 commandments, as we said, they're two equal copies, but we'll just use this for examples. So the first 5 commandments are between man and God, and the second 5 are between man and his fellow. So it's really interesting because it's like very, very, it's very specific in that sense. And this also goes back to the suzerain vassal covenant. So God is our suzerain. Moses is the vassal suzerain, and Yeshua also. There's a lot of mediators in the history of Israelites. And then there's me and Crystal and all of us. And we are fellow vassals. So we need to be loyal to each other because we're under the same suzerain. And then in the ancient Near East, one thing that they would say is that the vassals can't fight each other. So for example, the Hittites, whenever they would do a vassal covenant with whatever country, both of their vassals, they couldn't fight each other. And that was like the main thing. So don't fight each other, guys. Yes.
Why couldn't you fight each other? Like, what was the big deal about that?
Because then you're unloyal to your suzerain? Yes. What would you say is the reason?
I mean, I would say like you're dishonoring the suzerain.
Yes. Yeah. All right. So there's also two kinds of, another way of dividing the commandments. This is like more like fancy academia. There's the apodictic laws and there's the casuistic laws. We will explain, very fancy words. So apodictic laws, these are like absolute direct commandments. So this is thou shalt not murder. There's no exceptions and they're meant to be followed exactly. So it's a hard rule that doesn't change no matter the situation. So you're not going to kill nobody, period, right? Not if you get really mad, then you can do it. You know what I mean? And then you shall not steal. If you get really mad at the person, it doesn't matter. You don't steal, period. And they are clear and straightforward. There's no need to think too much about different circumstances and everything. There's nuance, but generally it's just don't do this, period. Okay? Yes.
It's interesting because these are unique to Israel. Like they don't really find that many apodictic laws in other places.
Interesting. And then so basically yes. So whenever you hear apodictic laws, the fancy word is basically commandments that are like don't do this, period. And then there's other kinds of commandments. There's a casuistic laws. So the casuistic laws are on a case-by-case basis. Think of casuistic as in causing. So something causes it to happen. So these are examples of situation explains what to do in situations. So if a man accidentally injures another man, then he should pay for his recovery. So if you don't injure somebody else, you don't have to pay recovery. It's not like don't kill, period. Don't steal, period. It's if this happens, then in that situation, you're going to do this. So those are the casuistic laws. Yes.
Will that apply if someone comes to try to kill you and you defend yourself? Then in that case, you'll apply this to like pay to make that person not die.
In that case, wouldn't that apply with like preservation of life? Yes. Yeah.
Because it's not an accident.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's why it's
Yeah.
like,
Because there's also the
Well,
issue of
it gets specific
Exactly.
because it gives you a specific scenario. So
Yeah.
it says like if you're cutting wood and then the head of your axe flies back and
Yeah.
it kills somebody, you know, it's not your fault.
yeah.
You know, just do this, and that. That's why it's casuistic because it's not supposed to be an exact scenario. It's a scenario that's similar, and then the judges they look over it, just like today with our laws. Like,
Yeah.
not all scenarios are exact, and the judge has to define
Yeah.
what is in the bounds of the law.
Yes, and then that's the importance of the Sanhedrin. So if there wasn't for the Sanhedrin, we wouldn't know what to do in the situation. So if something would happen, like that, God forbid, you have to go to the Sanhedrin and see what's going on. What do you do about that, right? So in this case, for example, if a man accidentally injures another man, what does that mean? In what context? With what does he injure? What constitutes an injury? Is it like I scrape somebody and I have to pay them $100? You know what I mean? But if you hurt somebody really badly and they can't work, so it all depends on a case-by-case basis. So that's the importance of the Sanhedrin. We can't just not have the Sanhedrin just figure this out on our own because we would lose our minds and we don't want to do that. And then, so these laws are meant to guide you on what to do in specific situations and might have different answers depending on what happens. And then usually the Sanhedrin takes care of letting us know what that is.
And the Sanhedrin's kind of like what today?
Yes, so it's kind of like the Supreme Court. So think of the Supreme Court, think of like the Israelite Sanhedrin. So basically casuistic laws are basically commandments that are like, if this happens, then you do this. So it's cause, casuistic causes. Something causes the commandment to happen, all right? So keep in mind this thing where we saw with the commandments between man and God and between man and his fellow. We're going to see it when we see the 10 commandments. So this is from the Tariag Mitzvot. They divide the commandments. So among the 10 commandments, there's more commandments. So it's not just 10 commandments per se, how they divide it. However, the word 10 commandments is also a little misleading because in Hebrew it's the 10 words or the 10 like decrees, the 10 aseret hadivot. So it's the 10 words. So it's really interesting because like we have like this thing where like it has to be 10 commandments, but it's actually 10 phrases, words that let you know what to do. So I am Hashem your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. And according to the Tariag Mitzvot, this one is the first commandment, and this one and the one after are the only two commandments that were heard directly from God himself. So it's really interesting. The other ones, like Moses said it, but this one God said it directly from the people to the people. So then again, what makes the Sinai Theophany so interesting and so unique is that the Israelites, they actually heard from God directly. And that doesn't happen with groups, ever, period. And then we saw that you shall have no other gods before me. So it's forbidden to even consider the possibility that there's any other deity other than Hashem. The commentary on the bottom is all from the Tariag Mitzvot, unless specified otherwise. So this is from there too. And then, is this an apodictic law or a casuistic law? Yes, exactly. It's an apodictic law. So don't do this, period. So you're not going to have any other gods. That's not up for debate. We're not going to see if there's a really, really cool God. Then in that case, no. It's no. No means no. So you shall not make yourselves a graven image or any likeness of anything. So the act of making idols is forbidden. This is from the Tariag Mitzvot again. Even if the one who makes the image does not worship it himself. Interesting. So, in case you guys are going to make like a little god, not to worship, but, just for fun. Don't do it. So.
That will be unapodictic.
Yes, exactly. So it's an apodictic law. So don't do this. Period. Now you shall not bow down to them, nor serve them. So the sages is really interesting because the sages actually forbid you to bend down before an idol in order to remove a thorn lodged in his foot. Basically, it's an example. Like, just don't prostrate yourself, even if you're not worshiping them. So like, if you're in public and there's like a Buddha statue there, and you're not gonna like scratch your foot, turn around, and then you scratch just in case. Even though you're not worshiping it, but that's like what the sages understood. It makes sense. It makes sense. Or to pick up coins which he has dropped in front of the idol. So if you accidentally, drop a coin in front of like a Buddha statue, oops, like don't do it. Just, figure out a way without bowing down by mistake. Yes, just slide the foot.
Yep.
Yeah. So is this an apodictic law or a casuistic? Yes. So it's don't do this, period. And then you shall not serve them. So there are 7 universal forms of worship according to the Tariag Mitzvot. It says that there's sacrifices, there's burning sacrifice flesh, there's wine and liquid libation, and there's prostration. Those are like the 4 universal forms of worship. Pretty much most religions use that to worship their gods in one form or the other, even the Israelites too. But in Israel, it's only one God, obviously. And is this an apodictic law or casuistic law? Yes, exactly. So don't do it, period. And then you also can't worship them by means of their own religions. Canaanite fertility rituals. We shall not speak of such things today for everybody's suggestion purposes. All right, so then you shall not take the name of Hashem in vain. So it's forbidden to swear in Hashem's name in vain. Is this an apodictic law or a casuistic law?
Apodictic law.
Yes. So don't do it, period. So to break a vow in which God's name has been invoked is to profane that name. If you guys remember, we've talked about it before, how the name is the place where a person's honor is symbolized and toward which honor or dishonor can be directed. So basically the name is kind of what symbolizes a person's status and their honor. So imagine God's name. Like if you swear by God's name and then you don't do it, what are you saying about God's honor? You're saying basically it doesn't matter. You know what I mean? If somebody says, I promise you by the honor of, I don't know, SpongeBob, and then you don't do it, right? So it's not really going to mean much because you just, you promise by SpongeBob. But SpongeBob doesn't mean anything, right? But if you promise by, for example, your friend's name, you know what I mean? Like that has some weight. That's why people swear by their mom and things like that, because it has like meaning. It's like very important, right? So imagine God's name. So God's name is supposed to be honored. That's why whenever we say the blessing, we say Baruch Atah. So you're blessed. We give honor to Hashem. So we can't swear in God's name in vain. Yeshua suggested we just don't swear, period, just to be safe. So, just take that advice. And then, number 7, the 7th commandment, not the 7th commandment, the 7th, in this division of commandments. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. So the Tariag mitzvot mentioned that we do this through wearing our best clothes, through eating fancy food, obviously through not working. But it's really interesting because if you guys remember the word remember, the word remember in Hebrew, it's not just you forgot something and then you remember. Is that you have the knowledge and then you put it, you apply it into a real life situation. So when God took the Israelites out of Egypt, he says, I have remembered my covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But what does it mean he remembered? That it means that he forgot and then he remembered? No, it means that he's going to act upon it now. That's what he told Moses, I remember the covenant. So whenever it says remember the Sabbath day, it's not that you're going to forget for the 7 days of the week and then you randomly remember on Saturday and you're like, oh, okay, now we're going to do the Shabbat. It's to always keep it in mind, and then when it's the 7th day, then you put it into action. This is an apodictic law or casuistic law?
Apodictic law.
Yes. So don't do it, period, or do this. Do this, period. All right, and then you shall do no work at all on Shabbat. So you work. All right, is this an apodictic law or a casuistic law?
Apodictic law.
Don't do it, period. So all the 10 commandments are apodictic laws. I was just trying to get the point across. So anyways, in case you didn't notice, there's a pattern here. All right, so this is the first 5 commandments. The next 5 commandments, so the first half are between man and God, and the second half are between man and his fellow. But it's really interesting because what is the first commandment in the section of between man and his fellow is between his father and his mother. You have to honor your father and your mother because that's what God used to bring you into this world. So it's really interesting how the first one in the man-to-man commandment is the one to honor your parents. So it just gives it like so much importance. It just shows you how important it is. And then you shall not kill. And this one is pretty self-explanatory.
Actually, it's murder.
What?
It's murder.
Oh, I'm sorry. And then you shall not commit adultery. And then I don't know. That's what Tariag mitzvot I think it says. I have to check.
Because then
I copy pasted. Yeah.
After that, they kill a lot of people.
Yeah. But yeah, so you shall not commit adultery. Period. Don't cheat. And then you shall not steal. Again, it's pretty self-explanatory. But again, there's also nuance. So there's a lot of people that they're like, well, what if I get something from the supermarket and I forget to pay it by mistake? Is that stealing? Is it by mistake? When I realize it, do I take it back? When do I take it back? Like, there's nuance in it, so that's why we need the Sanhedrin. Yes.
I have a question.
Yes.
What if you steal from your brother or sister?
That's still stealing.
That's still.
You said the word stealing?
You don't do it, period. What?
It's the same as the person that has like the medical disability of like stealing and still stealing.
What if they, what?
If they stole something from me?
Then
That's their problem
that's
with God.
take him to the Sanhedrin.
Your parents,
It's the same as, it has a name. There's this medical thing that like you steal and you don't realize that you're stealing. Yeah, that's still a sin because
Yeah.
they're stealing.
Yeah. So don't use that excuse.
Don't be like, oh, I'm klepto. No. Still, it's not an excuse.
Yeah.
Well, that's one of the sham like sins.
Yes.
So, so it's a big deal.
Yeah.
To steal.
Yeah. And then you can't take the offering to the temple. So you can't take the offering to the temple to remedy stealing unless you fix things with the person. So it's not like you can steal, then you remember it, and then you're like, you know what? Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry, God. You take the offering and you're done with it. No, you have to actually give the person back and then some. So it's not just you take the offering and it's done for. You actually have to fix things with the person. Yes. Yes.
I want to ask a question.
Okay.
Oh, so like Shabbat like is for 2 days, right? Yeah.
What?
No.
Okay. Well,
It's Friday night to
From
Saturday.
Yes.
sundown to
So what
sundown.
time does it start and end?
There's no real specific.
so when the sun goes down, that's now where like there's debates among like rabbinic, like the rabbis and everything. So in rabbinic Judaism, what is done to like make sure that Shabbat is always maintained, instead of starting at sunset, they light the candles 18 minutes before, just in case. Because some people say, well, that's after it's dark. Some people say, no, it's after the sun is a little bit under the horizon already. So it really just depends. So they instituted 18 minutes just in case. And then for Shabbat ending, that's why in Judaism, you wait until there's 3 stars in the sky.
Until it's dark.
Yeah, exactly, until it's totally dark. Some people say, well, if the sun already set, it's a little light outside, but it hasn't ended yet. But just in case, they establish that, because again, there's a lot of opinions. So that's
It's
what
better to be safe than sorry.
exactly. That's basically what they said.
So sunset to sunset.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, yeah. So then like there's the thing of like what is sunset? That's again never-ending discussions. But yes, sunset to sunset basically. All right, and then you shall not bear false witness. How can you have an orderly society if people are lying in court? Impossible. So don't do it.
What is bearing false witness?
So bearing false witness, basically, if Crystal is accused of something and I have a vendetta against her for some reason, Crystal's accused of something, she didn't do it, but I'm just like, yeah, you know what? I actually saw her stealing. And the judge is like, oh, okay, well, now we have a witness. Or imagine somebody is accused of murder. And then a person literally says, yeah, they did it. And then we have another witness, another false witness, and then they get convicted because of lies, right? So you can't really have an orderly, righteous, and just society with that.
And if they discover that, you're also in trouble because
Exactly.
you lie.
Exactly. Yep. And then you shall not covet your neighbor's house. Again, self-explanatory, because what is the point of coveting? Why is it part of the 10 Commandments? Because when you covet something, you're probably gonna like do one of the things that you're not supposed to do according to the 10 Commandments. So if you covet your neighbor's wife, yes,
What does
okay.
it mean to covet?
So the covet is basically you really, really, really want something and you want to take it by force.
Kind of like David and was it Uzziah?
Exactly. So that's a great example. So David coveted the Uzziah's wife. So what did he do? He murdered somebody and he committed adultery. So he broke 2 of the commandments of the 10 Commandments for not following the bottom one. So the bottom one, a lot of people say that like you start from the bottom up. So you can't really get to loving God until you start from the bottom. So you can't get to the top commandment without starting with the bottom one. Because if you don't start with stopping coveting stuff, then you're going to steal, you might murder, God forbid, and you might commit adultery. So that's kind of like the starting point of disaster. So don't do it. All right, and so now we kind of get the idea of this. What does this mean, right? So remember, the Shema is considered the confession of faith. Is considered the what's it called? Oath. Yes, kind of like, yeah. So when you take the oath to God and to the Torah, the Shema. So that's why you say it in the morning and in the evening every single day. So when you take that oath, you take the oath to follow the whole Torah. Obviously, nobody's perfect, and there's sacrifices and there's atonement and there's for that. So obviously, we're not saying you have to be perfect all the time. However, it's the oath that you take, and you have to love your neighbor as yourself. So you're gonna keep all these commandments if you love your neighbor. So if you love your neighbor, you're not gonna covet his stuff because you're gonna love your neighbor. You're not gonna want to take his stuff away. You're not gonna bear false witness against your neighbor. You're not gonna steal against them if you love them. You're not gonna commit adultery if, well, you know what I mean. You're not gonna murder them. Yes.
No, I just realized the numbers. Why do they go past 10?
I don't know. That's the Tariag mitzvot. So like, for example, the Shabbat is like 2. So yeah.
Oh no, okay.
Yeah. So it's like it's the 10 words, but then there's like subcategories among them. I'm sure there's probably disagreement. I wouldn't be surprised if somebody's like, you know what, that's not right. but that's the daria mitzvot. So yeah, so if you love your neighbor, you're not gonna do all that stuff. And if you love God, you're gonna keep Shabbat. You're not gonna have any other idols because you love God. Obviously, why would you want idols if you love God? If you're loyal to God, right? So basically, when they asked him which is the most important one, he's like, all of them, but if you want specifics, these two. And it covers all of the commandments. It covers the one between man and God and between man and his fellow. So now just to finish up, something really just more of a fun fact. If you guys remember the Mishnah, basically it's like a temple manual / historical book / Sanhedrin's ruling catalog and other things. There's a lot there. So there's a lot of temple stuff, but there's a lot. So it's kind of hard to like summarize in one phrase. So if you guys remember, we have the two offerings, the AM Tamid and the PM Tamid. So this is the one that kind of opened the sacrificial service, I guess we could say it, and the one that closed it. There was no sacrifices before or after except on Passover, where there's like a little exception. Yes.
Tamid, can you elaborate?
Yes, Tamid is the continuous offering. So Tamid in Hebrew means continual, or in modern Hebrew just means always. So just it's the always offering.
What continual means?
Every day.
Every day.
Period. So basically our prayer services are based on these offerings. So we have the Shaharit in the morning and the Mincha during the afternoon. That's why you see Yeshua's students, they went, it mentions at the 3rd hour and at the 9th hour, they went to the temple to pray because people usually would get together to pray specifically in the afternoon. Supposedly it was more common to go pray in the temple and during the afternoon one. And that's a whole rabbit hole, how like the afternoon time is the best time to pray to God and you get answered faster. That's in the Bible. It's crazy.
Because it was like later in the day.
Yeah. But it's really interesting because a lot of prophets, like they call it the Et Ratzon, so like the hour of like, hora propicia. How do you say hora propicia in English? Yeah, what? A proper time, a kind of proper time, like the time that God wants, the wanting time. So basically they call it that in the afternoon, and like there's a lot of prophets where like they waited until like there's a prophet where it mentions that he was praying during the afternoon time and God answered him immediately. Zacharias in the temple, John's dad, he actually was praying during the afternoon prayer, and immediately that's where he gets a theophany. So it's all coming together.
It's not only done in Shabbat, it's done every day.
Yeah, every day. Yeah. Period. All right, and then every morning in the temple, so in the second temple, the Decalogue, so the 10 Commandments, and the Shema were recited along with the prayer of the Emet V'Yatziv. This one is all included in the Shaharit and the Shema. So basically, if you look at the Siddur, all the section that's like about the Shema, and then right before the Amidah, it was all, like, according to the Mishnah, all said in the morning, every single day. So it's really interesting how, like, the prayers, they're the same thing. But it's really interesting that the 10 Commandments were included. However, nowadays, they're not. Why is that so? So does anybody want to read this? Okay.
After the priests completed laying the parts of the daily offering on the ram, they went to the chamber of hewn stone to recite Shema. The appointed priest, who oversaw the lotteries in the temple, said to the priest, "Recite a single blessing of the blessings that accompany Shema." And the members of the priestly watch recited a blessing. And then they recited the 10 Commandments, Shema, V'chaya im Shamoa, and Vayomer, the standard formula of Shema.
Exactly. So nowadays we say the same thing in the same order, except for the 10 Commandments. Why is that so? And then the Tefillin in the Qumran, they actually found the 10 Commandments inside of them too. So it's really, really important. These are examples of the Tefillin in the, so if anybody tells you this is a rabbinic invention, just show them this. So like, no, it's not. All right, so why aren't they included in the Siddur nowadays? You can't find them in the Siddur. So basically, there's this thing in the Talmud where it says, Rabbi Yehuda said that Shmuel said, even in the outlying areas outside the temple, they sought to recite the 10 Commandments in this manner every day. So basically, people would say the 10 Commandments every single day. But they had already abolished the recitation of the 10 Commandments due to the grievance of the heretics who argued that the entire Torah, with the exception of the 10 Commandments, did not emanate from God. The 10 Commandments were recited daily. That would lend credence to their claims, so that recitation was expunged from the daily prayers. That's a lot of words. Basically, what it's saying is that there is these heretic guys, and they were saying that the only legit part of the Torah is the 10 Commandments, and everything else did not come from God. So since the 10 Commandments were said every day, people were scared that if you say it every day, you're going to give them legitimacy. You're going to be like, yeah, we're saying the 10 Commandments, so we're basically saying that you're right. So to avoid the heretics being right, they just took it off. And we decided we're not going to do that, to not let them, take advantage of it and be like, yeah, the 10 Commandments is the only legit part of the Torah. So fun fact of the day. I thought it was really cool. I don't know. So, to review, theophany is a visible or tangible manifestation of God. In most cases, theophany narratives, the person's relationship with God changes. So we see with prophet Ezekiel and Isaiah and Moses and the Israelites and among others. So whenever they had that encounter with God, it's not just for God to show off, obviously. It's to change the relationship of that person that has to God and to give them a purpose or a commission. So the Torah is a suzerain vassal covenant. We're probably going to talk about that a lot later on. And then apodictic commandments is you shall not, period. And then casuistic commandments is if this happens, then you're going to do this. And then there's commandments between man and God versus commandments between man and his fellow. And that's basically it. Shavua Tov.